Pull some Kevlar off the Kevlar winch and feed it through the pumping chamber from top to bottom. Then once fed through the chamber, have the driller break the top rod off, and we will feed the Kevlar through that top rod from the top to bottom, and it might help to tie it to a wrench to get it to go down. Then once the Kevlar is through the bottom of the rod, feed it through the pulley wheel on the anchor. Then feed a tape measure through the rod from top to bottom, and we'll tape the Kevlar to the end of the tape measure and then run the tape measure back up through the rod. And there it is, taped on, running it back up. Then once you have the Kevlar back out the top of the rod, tie both strands to the driller's wire line, which we had them crimp into a loop, and then you'll have the drillers pull on the wire line to pull the anchor into the top rod slowly. And guide it in so the plugs don't get caught above the brush. Put the pulley anchor all the way in, then have them stop pulling on the wire line. Then pull the Kevlar back and untie it from the wire line. You might need pliers to untie it because it'll be tight. Then you'll feed the loose end of the Kevlar back up through the pumping chamber from bottom to top, and the best way we found to do that was to tape it to the strand of Kevlar that's already going through the pumping chamber and then pull them both through. Like that. So pull them both through, even out the lines, and so you can slide the pumping chamber down onto the rod and then thread the pumping chamber into the rod. Being careful not to let the Kevlar lines twist. It might help to tape them together. Hang the shiv wheel in line with the top rod and tie off the loose end of the Kevlar onto the handle of the shiv wheel, and put the other end, the end going to the winch, through the wheel, and then position the wheel so that the Kevlar is shooting out as straight as possible from the rod to avoid rubbing on the rod. Then take up the slack in the Kevlar winch. One thing we started doing was to tape off the end of the Kevlar where it goes into that pumping chamber nut. This is the end that's tied to the shiv wheel, since that'll be constantly rubbing against that nut the whole time you're pumping, and we don't want that to break. Then we'll attach the water line to the pumping chamber. Then, after making sure the Kevlar winch is ratcheted down securely, have the driller start pumping, gradually increase pressure, and watch for the Kevlar to start spooling out. And you might want to secure the shiv wheel a little better than we did. And monitor the Kevlar winch, because if that brush suddenly gets pushed down, it can cause the winch to jump and you'll have a back spool. Here's a later hole with the tape on the Kevlar where it's going into that nut, and then a more secure shiv wheel. And Chris monitoring the winch to make sure it doesn't get a backspool. Once that anchor pops out of rods, the water pressure will drop and you'll have slack in your line. You might want to have the driller ramp the pressure up a couple times just to make sure that that brush doesn't move anymore. And then you can remove the water line and unscrew the pumping chamber. Then you can spool out 5 to 10 meters of Kevlar from the Kevlar winch and cut it off. Then untie the Kevlar from the shiv wheel handle. Then hold on to both ends of the Kevlar and have the drillers run the rods up and make sure that the rods, or that the line, the Kevlar doesn't move when the rods move, and this means that the brush is out of rods. Make sure you don't drop the Kevlar down the rods when you're doing this. Then even out the two sides of the Kevlar so you have the same amount sticking out the rod, and tape them into a ball that is small enough to fit down through a rod, and leave enough slack beneath the ball but above the top of the rod so that you can trip a rod out without losing the Kevlar down the rod. So the slack needs to be longer than a single rod's length. Then tape the Kevlar slack, the two lines together for protection, and then you'll have the drillers trip the first rod out, break it, and pull the Kevlar ball down the rod and out, and then trip the next rod, and keep doing that until they've tripped all the way out of the hole.